At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
This episode is brought to you by Greenlight. Get this. Adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Spotify. Greenlight.com/Spotify.
EVO. This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. There are exclusive clubs that have existed throughout the history of mankind. And I don't mean the kind of club where you have to wear a tie and pay membership dues. No, I'm talking about the type of club where very few people have accomplished an amazing feat, have survived some incredible disaster, or committed some unspeakable act. 7,269. As of this writing, that's the number of human beings out of the approximately 100 billion to have inhabited Earth to have stood on the summit of Mount Everest. The climbing season is almost upon us, so that number is sure to grow. That number shrinks, though, to 188 if you add the distinction of summiting Mount Everest without the assistance of supplemental oxygen. To do that requires years of training, incredible cardiovascular fitness, and a mental toughness that's exceedingly rare. The height of Everest is 29,031 feet 8.5 inches above sea level, the highest such mountain on the planet. Now, instead of going up, let's go down. The Mariana Trench is an oceanic canyon created by the incredible violence of two tectonic plates meeting beneath the western Pacific Ocean, roughly halfway between Japan and Papua New Guinea. One plate is forced beneath the other, and a large, incredibly deep trench is formed. That trench is shaped like a fishhook, and at the southern end of that hook lies what's known as the Challenger Deep, the lowest known point of the deepest known trench on planet Earth. The bottom of Challenger Deep lies 36,037 feet below sea level, more than a mile deeper beneath the surface than the summit of Everest is above it. The number of humans who have visited the bottom of Challenger Deep? 12. Now let's go back up, way up. I mean, we have to go way up to find a number comparable to what we see for the Challenger Deep. Number of humans who have walked on the moon? Also 12. Kind of weird, right? But the exclusive club I'd like to mention is far more, but not quite, terrestrial. It's called the Halfway to Hell Club, and there are a scant 19 members. Welcome back to The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow. You're listening to Episode 8, Fraud. On June 22, 1933, Diane Goldman was born in the city of San Francisco. Her father, Leon Goldman, was a successful surgeon, and her mother, Betty, was a retired fashion model. Young Diane's paternal grandparents were Jewish immigrants from Poland, while her maternal grandparents, the Rosenbergs, were from St. Petersburg, Russia. Now, the Rosenbergs were of German Jewish ancestry. However, like all Jews living in St. Petersburg at that time, they were forced to practice Russian Orthodox Christianity. So it was Christianity that was passed down to young Diane, with her mother enrolling her in a prestigious Catholic school from which she graduated in 1951. Then it was on to Stanford, for Diane proved to be something of an academic prodigy. She graduated from Stanford in 1955 with a degree in history, and despite her mother's urging, Diane, at every step of the way, would insist that her religion was Judaism. In 1962, shortly after Diane decided to pursue a life in politics, she married neurosurgeon Bertram Feinstein. And it was with this name, Diane Feinstein, that she would be elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, on which she would serve for 8 years, until the assassination of sitting mayor George Moscone that propelled Feinstein, by virtue of being president of the Board of Supervisors, into the role of acting mayor of the city of San Francisco. Soon after, the board voted to make her position permanent, and on December 4th, 1978, Diane Feinstein became the first female mayor of the city of San Francisco. A failed run for governor of the state of California in 1990 led her to pivot to a run for the U.S. Senate in 1992, a race she won and an office she would hold for more than 30 years, until her death in 2023 at the age of 90. Curiously, another milestone event that would come to define San Francisco and America began in that city by the bay the same year that Diane Feinstein was born. 1933 saw the groundbreaking for the engineering and artistic masterpiece known as the Golden Gate Bridge. Both Diane Feinstein and the Golden Gate Bridge factor heavily into our story. But what about the Halfway to Hell Club? Now, I'm no engineer, but I've read a ton of books about bridges and the various methods of construction. So, a suspension bridge like the Golden Gate is built in distinct phases. First up are the anchorages, which in the case of the Golden Gate amounted to 60,000-ton concrete blocks on either side of the bay that the suspension cables would be attached to. These blocks would be responsible for holding up the entire weight of the bridge. Then, the piers that the towers would stand on are built next. The towers were made in massive sections at Bethlehem Steel in Pennsylvania and then assembled like a giant Lego set on the completed piers. Then the first cable was strung over each tower and attached to the anchorages. The process of spinning the main cables took more than 7 months, as each cable consisted of 27,572 individual galvanized steel wires. After the main cables are spun and attached to the anchorages, the main deck, what we eventually drive on, would get installed in sections, starting from each side, and then they meet in the middle. The deck is attached to the main suspension cable by secondary suspension cables, or what's called hangers, the vertical cables that hang from the main cables at intervals of 50 feet. All in all, in addition to the 60,000-ton concrete anchorages, the total weight of the bridge is 840 million pounds. It contains over 80,000 miles of steel wire and is held together by more than 1.2 million steel rivets. The bridge covers more than 1.7 miles of the Golden Gate Strait and took more than 47,000 gallons of international orange paint to give it its iconic look. Of the thousands of men and women who worked tirelessly to complete the project, sadly, 11 were killed during construction. The first was a man named Kermit Moore on October 21st, 1936. Mr. Moore was crushed when a crane was toppled by heavy winds. The other 10 workers died in the same accident that occurred on February 17, 1937, when a scaffold they were all working on collapsed and fell directly through a safety net and plunged into the frigid waters of the bay 220 feet below. But it's that safety net that I want to tell you about. Back then, when a bridge worker fell to his death, he was said to have, quote, gone to hell. The construction of the Golden Gate Bridge was among the first to incorporate a safety net running the entire length to prevent worker fatalities. And other than the collapsed scaffold incident, something that the net was not designed to endure, the net worked flawlessly. During construction, it saved the life of 19 men, one of whom was a local steel worker named Al Zampa. Although his life was saved, Al sustained some serious injuries in the fall and wound up hospitalized, alongside 3 other men who had also been saved by the safety net. From their hospital beds, they officially formed what they dubbed the Halfway to Hell Club. The 19 men who were saved by the safety net during the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge are the only members, now and forever, of that exclusive club. In the immediate aftermath of the Pan murder in an upscale neighborhood in San Francisco, as mentioned last episode, San Francisco police reached out to the LA County Sheriff's Department with what they thought seemed like evidence that could possibly tie their murder to what was now known as the Night Stalker serial killer from Los Angeles. Specifically, a shoe print and ballistics evidence. And more generally, the fact that it was a home invasion type attack through an unlocked window in the middle of the night. There were other similarities. Husband shot in the head, wife sexually assaulted, and the home was ransacked and valuables were stolen. Their hunch proved true, and now 2 jurisdictions separated by 350 miles had to come to grips with the fact that the Night Stalker had now thrown them his biggest curveball to date. A new major metropolitan area that was completely unprepared for what Ramirez was capable of. So, as people and cities sometimes do, San Francisco panicked, and their mayor, the Honorable Dianne Feinstein, made a costly error. As you've listened to this series, what has been the one consistent piece of evidence discovered at virtually every crime scene? The one consistent forensic detail in a crime spree that was basically defined by Ramirez's inconsistencies. That's right, the shoe prints. The size 11.5 Avia men's aerobic shoe. Now, our detectives, Salerno and Carrillo, kept this information quiet for several reasons. One was that despite the same shoe prints being at all the crime scenes, it wasn't definitive proof. I mean, other people could have those shoes, right? Well, not really, it turns out. Salerno and Carrillo worked tirelessly and quietly with the shoe's manufacturer and distributors to get a sense of how many pairs of this size and style they were actually dealing with. And the number shocked them. The shoes were exceedingly rare. In fact, of all the Avia men's aerobic shoe, model 440, in size 11.5, only 6 pairs were shipped to retailers west of the Mississippi, with 5 pairs going to Arizona, and only 1 was shipped to a retailer in downtown Los Angeles. 1 pair. And further, the pair that was shipped to Los Angeles was unique among the 6 pairs that wound up out west. The colorway of the LA pair was black on black. The other pairs were white. Salerno and Carrillo now had some serious forensic evidence that would hold up in court. Ramirez would likely be the only guy in California with a pair of black Avia 440s in the size 11.5 that were sold in early 1985. If they could find him in possession of those sneakers, they could tie him directly to every crime scene. Then, on August 23, 1985, Dianne Feinstein called a press conference. Important to note, investigators from Los Angeles were very clear about how vitally important it was to keep the particulars of the case under wraps so as to not tip off the bad guy to the nature of the evidence collected against him. But
they also knew one of the weapons was a .22 caliber pistol. That information was under wraps until San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein held a news conference and revealed every detail.
The same ballistics on, I understand, more than a dozen murders.
When Carrillo found out, he was furious.
As a result, Richard got rid of the shoes and got rid of a gun over the Golden Gate Bridge.
So on the evening of the 23rd, Richard Ramirez, having been paying close attention to the news media, especially after they gave him what he felt was a really cool name, walked out onto the Golden Gate Bridge carrying a pillowcase, and one by one dropped his .22 caliber handgun, and then his size 11.5 men's aerobic shoes, model number 440, black on black. The police, suffice it to say, were not happy.
And last week, San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein announced ballistic tests have definitely linked the murder of a man there to the Night Stalker. But release of that information has outraged a Los Angeles sheriff frustrated by the difficulty of tracking a random murderer.
It places this community in jeopardy because it impedes our ability to go forward fully with the investigation.
Dante, the wayfarer, the poet of exile, had passed through the threshold of terrors and traversed the realms of suffering that had humbled even the mightiest of men. The air thickened with an acrid stench as he approached the looming chasm, where the eighth circle of hell, called Malabolge, lay sprawled like the ruined remnants of a fallen empire. Here was the dominion of fraud, where deception was the currency of eternal punishment, and the denizens were those who had misused wit and cunning, twisting trust into treachery. Virgil, ever his steady guide, placed a hand upon Dante's shoulder. Here, my son, are the Bolge, 10 trenches, each one a chasm of its own making, brimming with those who perverted the gifts of intellect and speech for personal gain. Prepare yourself, for what you shall see here is no lesser torment than in the lower pits. As they descended, the landscape revealed itself, a vast and jagged expanse of rock, divided by deep ridges that framed the Bolge, deep ditches festering with corruption, each punishing a particular brand of fraud. These trenches were connected by bridges of cracked stone, allowing Dante and his guide to pass over the writhing masses. The walls of this abyss glowed with a dull, sickly light, neither warm nor divine, but a feverish phosphorescence that outlined the grotesque forms below. They first beheld the panderers and seducers, driven forward by demons brandishing whips. Their bodies were raw with lash marks, and they stumbled in their forced march, their wails lost in the endless chasm. These are those who used persuasion, not for art or truth, but for self-serving deceit, Virgil explained. Among them, Dante glimpsed once adored figures, their faces twisted in agony. Beyond them, the next was the trench of flatterers, and it seethed with filth, a river of excrement, flowing endlessly as the damned clawed at its banks, their mouths still spewing lies despite the eternal condemnation. Dante recoiled at the stench, for here was the foul byproduct of words that had been emptied of sincerity. One soul raised his soiled hands, trying to form words, but all that emerged was a bubbling, unclean breath. Crossing over the next bridge, they peered into the third Bolgia, where the simoniacs, those who sold sacred offices for personal gain, were planted headfirst into rock crevices, their feet on fire. Their feet flailed as though seeking for traction on some unseen ground, but there was none to be found. A memory stirred in Dante, recalling men who had promised salvation only to barter it like a commodity. They turned the divine into commerce, and now they are bartered by hell itself, Virgil murmured. Dante shuddered as they move on, encountering the trench of sorcerers and false prophets. Here, those who had attempted to divine the truth found themselves grotesquely punished, their heads twisted backward, so they could only walk in reverse, their own fate forever unknown to them. Their weeping eyes now faced their past sins, eternally unable to look forward, a cruel irony befitting their deceit. In the depths of the fifth Bolgia, the corrupt politicians writhed in a lake of boiling tar. As Dante watched, demons known as the Malebranche jabbed them with hooks, forcing them beneath the viscous surface whenever they tried to rise. Here, power was wielded in shadows, and so in shadows they remain, drowning in the very darkness they cultivated, Virgil remarked. Dante's heart wrenched at the sight, for he knew such men in Florence, their hands hidden, but stained nonetheless. Further down, in the sixth Bolgia, the hypocrites moved in gilded cloaks that shimmered like treasure, but were lined with lead so heavy they could barely move. The burden of false virtue now weighed upon them for eternity. Among them, Dante glimpsed a friar whose hollow sermonizing had masked avarice. His eyes pleaded for pity, but none could be found here. The seventh Bolgia yawned before them, revealing the thieves, their bodies entwined with writhing serpents. Dante watched in horror as a thief was bitten, his flesh dissolving into a monstrous form before reshaping into another sinner. Their very identities, stolen in life, were now stripped away continuously and endlessly. The eighth Bolgia held fraudulent counselors, those who had twisted wisdom into manipulation. They were imprisoned in flames that flickered like tongues, their voices absorbed by fire, their sins now consuming them from within. Dante hesitated as he recognized a voice, recalling a man who had once led with words as honeyed as they were venomous. They pressed on, coming to the ninth Bolgia, where the sowers of discord were grotesquely mutilated, limbs severed, wounds splitting open anew with every step. These were the men who had torn unity asunder. Politicians, religious zealots, their cries mingled in a cacophony of regret. And finally, in the 10th Bolgia, the very depths of fraud, lay the falsifiers, alchemists, perjurers, and counterfeiters. Their bodies were ravaged with disease, their flesh rotting as they clawed at each other. Here, the illusion of prosperity and health had turned to decay and ruin. Dante, overwhelmed, clutched at Virgil's robes. This abyss is deeper than I imagined. Is there no end to deceit? Virgil's eyes were solemn. Human ambition, unchecked, can fashion endless variations of fraud. And yet, worse lies below. Take heart, poet, for beyond this place, our journey nears its most terrible depths. Dante, though shaken, steadied himself. He had come far, and the last leg of his journey awaited. With a deep breath, he followed Virgil downwards, into the frozen realm where betrayal, the darkest fraud of all, awaited its judgment.
Still getting around to that fix on your car? You got this. On eBay, you'll find millions of parts guaranteed to fit. Doesn't matter if it's a major engine repair or your first time swapping your windshield wipers. eBay has that part you need, ready to click perfectly into place. for changes big and small. Loud or quiet, find all the parts you need at prices you'll love. Guaranteed to fit every time. But you already know that. eBay. Things, people, love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
Clorox Sentiva smells like lavender. Cleans like Clorox. And feels like...
All right, that could go on for a while. Experience the long-lasting freshness of Clorox Sentiva. Now available in Clorox Sentiva Lavender-Scented Bleach. Use as directed.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Commercial Insurance. Business owners, meet Progressive Insurance. They make it easy to get discounts on commercial auto insurance and find coverages to grow with your business. Quote in as little as 6 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company. Coverage provided and serviced by affiliated and third-party insurers. Discounts and coverage selections not available in all states or situations.
Este episodio es presentado por Honda. Descubra la nueva Honda Passport Trail Sport Todoterreno. La Passport más todoterreno que Honda haya imaginado jamás. Esta Passport cuenta con mayor altura al suelo, barras de techo en todas sus versiones y neumáticas especialmente diseñados para cualquier terreno. Además, disfruta todos tus viajes con el control de clima de 3 zonas, techo panorámico y opciones como asientos delanteros con calefacción y ventilación. Conoce más en honda.com/Passport.
Ramirez didn't stick around San Francisco once he knew what they knew. He came back to Los Angeles, back to his adopted home, his drug dealers, his fence, his home turf. He stole a car, an orange Toyota station wagon, and headed south out of downtown to the city of Mission Viejo. This was the beginning of the end for the Night Stalker. Mission Viejo, California, roughly 75 miles southeast of downtown, is what's referred to as a commuter city in Orange County. Also known as a bedroom community, a commuter city means there isn't much industry or any business district really to speak of. It's nearly all residential, and the residents commute to and from work. Like most of Orange County, Mission Viejo is upper middle class, relatively low in crime, and a really nice place to live. On the evening of August 24th, 1985, Richard Ramirez drove that orange Toyota to a house on Via Zaragoza that belonged to James Romero Jr. It was earlier than he usually arrived at a potential target house, and that would cost him. The Romero family had just returned from a vacation, and most had gone to bed early, all except 13-year-old James Romero III. Young James was awake and remembered that he had left his pillow in his dad's truck. When he went out to the driveway to retrieve it, he heard an animal, or at least what he thought was an animal, rustling in the bushes. He walked across the front yard to investigate, but found nothing. Back inside, instead of going to sleep, the boy decided to get a little work done on his mini bike that he had parked in the garage, and it was there that he heard another noise. But this time, it was no animal. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps just outside the garage door. James concealed himself in the garage and saw, through the window, a man stealthily approaching the front door. James immediately took this man as a threat and rushed upstairs to wake his parents. The sound of rushing footsteps inside the house and multiple lights being turned on alerted Ramirez that he'd been discovered, and he ran away, back to his stolen car. Young James ran out of the house, not to pursue, but hopefully to get some information of the suspected burglar that had almost broken in. And he did. He was able to get a description of the orange Toyota as it drove away, along with a partial license plate. He gave that information to his dad, who then called it in, again, as a suspected burglar. The Romeros, once the adrenaline wore off and they realized how exhausted they were from traveling, called it a night and went back to bed. But for Ramirez, the night was just beginning.
Police today continue to search for any clues in the near-fatal shooting of 29-year-old William Carnes and the rape of his girlfriend. They're apparently the latest victims of the Night Stalker, thought to be responsible now for 34 brutal attacks, 14 of them fatal. These serial killings, once confined to the near Los Angeles area, are now spread over 500 miles from San Francisco to Orange County. Just as before, the assailant entered a house in a quiet middle-class neighborhood in the pre-dawn hours on Sunday through an unlocked window and attacked the couple while they slept. Neighbors are terrified.
I just sleep with my hand on right by my bed and a sawed-off shotgun, which I always have.
I see. Why is that?
Because if anybody comes in my house, they're not leaving.
The killer, who attacks randomly, is described as white, 25 to 30 years old, with a predominant feature of badly stained teeth. So 5,000...
Less than an hour later, at a different house in Mission Viejo, Ramirez slowly approached in the darkness. He pried a screen off a living room window and entered the home of 29-year-old Bill Carnes. Bill lived with his fiancée, Inez Erickson, and the two were sound asleep as the intruder calmly stood at the foot of their bed. Without alerting the sleeping couple, Ramirez opened fire on Bill, shooting him directly in the face 3 times. Inez awoke to a nightmare. Ramirez smiled his rotten smile and introduced himself as the Night Stalker. The first time we know of that he used the name to identify himself. He then proceeded to beat Inez with his fists before binding her arms and ankles with neckties from the closet. He forced her repeatedly to swear that she loved Satan as he tore through the house searching for valuables. Then he returned to the bedroom, grabbed Inez, and dragged her to a different room in the house, where he raped her repeatedly. As Ramirez left the house, he told Inez, "Tell them the Night Stalker was here." Police were quick to connect the dots of what went down that evening in Mission Viejo. First, Ramirez visited the Romero residence, but was discovered before he could break in, so he settled on his second option, the Carnes-Erickson residence. The good news was, if that theory proved true, they had a description of the vehicle used by the Night Stalker. An APB was issued for the greater Los Angeles area, making sure everybody was on the lookout for an orange Toyota station wagon. Meanwhile, Detectives Salerno and Carrillo finally had the opportunity to go through the stolen car that had been towed to an impound lot. We covered it last episode. The car from Eagle Rock where the assailant drew a pentagram on the windshield before running away. Well, apparently, the man took great care in wiping the car down for prints because police couldn't find any. But they did find an appointment card for a dentist in downtown Los Angeles. They didn't find their suspect there, but they were able to see the dental records for the person whose name was on the card. Richard Mena. It wasn't much, but it was something. And the dental records they saw matched the description of someone who could be claimed to have stinking, rotten teeth. Then, on August 28th, the stolen orange Toyota was found in a parking lot just off Skid Row in downtown LA. And this time, they caught a miracle. Although it seemed the entire inside of the car had been wiped down with near surgical precision, there was one spot Ramirez missed. How many times have you gotten into a car that wasn't yours? A friend's car, a rental car? What are the first things you do? You make sure the car is safe for you to drive. And how do we do that? We adjust things. The seat, like how far is it from the steering wheel? Let's get it right. The side view mirror. But all of those things were wiped down. But what about the rear view mirror? All it took was a probably unconscious act of giving that mirror a quick adjustment while driving that he forgot about. Because right there, right on that windshield-mounted rearview mirror, was a perfectly preserved fingerprint. Now, it still wasn't a slam dunk. Remember, nothing was really computerized back then. They couldn't just run the print and hope for some supercomputer to spit out a match. It still required police work. They needed a suspect to compare the print to. But for the first time in 18 months, the tide seemed to be turning in favor of the police. And remember, cops up in San Francisco were hard at work as well. And they had the most promising tip yet in the form of a stolen bracelet. It was pretty basic police work, really. The family of Peter and Barbara Pan made a list of items that were stolen from their home. That list was disseminated to local pawn shops and secondhand stores, as well as slipped to their circle of informants in the fence community. And they got a hit. A bracelet that was owned by Barbara Pan got flagged at a local shop. Police pressed the owner for who'd sold it to them, and they got a name: Armando Rodriguez. What the cops didn't know yet was that Armando had grown up in El Paso with a kid named Richard Ramirez before settling in San Francisco. The two remained friends, with Armando acting as an emergency fence when necessary. San Francisco detective Frank Falzone ran the interview with Armando and, quite literally, beat it out of him. Armando gave up the name Richard Ramirez. Falzone isn't shy about his tactics either. He's quoted as saying, "It wasn't my best punch, but it certainly wasn't my worst." Next week on the finale of The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow, the noose is tightening as the police now have a name and a fingerprint. And they would soon have a face to go with the monster they called the Night Stalker. Plus, we arrive at the deepest level of Dante's hell. That's next week on The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.